The inventory listed the contents of Ashvale Manor in 3 columns: furniture, fixtures, and staff. Seraphina Wycliffe read the 3rd column twice. It contained 6 names. Hers was not among them. She had known this was coming. She had known since the morning her father's solicitor arrived at the door with his hat in his hand and his mouth already forming the shape of an apology. The estate had been sold. The debts had been considerable. Lord Wycliffe, the late Earl of Ashvale, had spent his final years being considerably more generous with creditors than with his only daughter, and by the time he died in February, there was nothing left to give her except the truth, which she would have preferred not to have. The new owner was a man named Callum Drever. He held no title. He had made his money in shipping, or wool, or something that involved the movement of things across distances. And he had purchased Ashvale Manor with the brisk efficiency of a man who bought estates the way other men bought horses. Not because he needed one, but because he had decided he wanted one and could afford to. She had met him once, at a distance. She had been standing at the far end of the West Field, watching the removal men carry out the oak writing desk that had belonged to her grandfather, and he had been standing at the top of the front steps reviewing something with his solicitor. He had not looked up. She had not moved. That was 3 months ago. She had spent those 3 months in the cottage of her father's former housekeeper, Mrs. Treadwell, who lived 2 miles from the estate gates, and who had known Seraphina since she was 7 years old, and had once found her crying in the kitchen garden over a dead sparrow, and had not told anyone. Mrs. Treadwell had said, without being asked, that there was a position available at the manor, a housemaid. The new owner was bringing in new staff, but there were gaps. Mrs. Treadwell had a cousin on the household roll. Seraphina had said she didn't think that was a good idea. Mrs. Treadwell had poured more tea and waited. It took 4 days. It was, Seraphina would later think, the most reasonable amount of time it could possibly have taken. She gave her name as Sarah Finch. She borrowed a dress from Mrs. Treadwell's younger sister, and she arrived at the servants' entrance on a Tuesday morning with her hair pinned differently than she had ever worn it, which was not as effective a disguise as she had hoped, but it was the only one she had. The housekeeper who interviewed her was a woman named Mrs. Holt, small and precise, and the kind of person who listened to every answer you gave and then asked the one question you hadn't prepared for. And before this, Mrs. Holt had asked, meaning previous employment. I was in service in Yorkshire, Seraphina had said. The family relocated. Mrs. Holt had looked at her hands. Seraphina's hands were the problem. She had known this going in. They were not the hands of a woman who had been in service since girlhood. They were the hands of a woman who had played pianoforte and written letters and done embroidery and nothing of any practical consequence for 26 years, and no amount of scrubbing them against the stone wall of Mrs. Treadwell's garden had done anything except make them red. You'll be on the upper rooms, Mrs. Holt had said in a tone that indicated the conversation was over. You'll start Thursday. This was how Seraphina came back to her own house. It was a strange thing, she discovered, to clean rooms you had once lived in. The long gallery on the first floor, where she had spent entire afternoons as a child pressing her nose against the cold glass of the windows and watching the deer at the edge of the tree line. She was responsible for the windows now, which she found bleakly appropriate, her father's study, which still smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, even though everything in it had been replaced. The new owner had brought in bookshelves of a different wood, and the light fell on them wrong in the afternoons, and she could not explain to anyone why that bothered her as much as it did. She learned to be invisible. It was easier than she had expected. Staff, she discovered, were not so much invisible as simply not looked at directly. People looked through you, or around you, or at the thing you were holding, but almost never at your face. This was either efficient or sad, and she had not yet decided which. Callum Drever arrived on a Friday in April. She had not been on the front steps to receive him. That was for the senior staff. She had been upstairs, changing the linen in the blue bedroom. When she heard the carriage on the drive, and then the sound of the front door, and then the silence that fell over the house the way a held breath falls over a room. She met him that evening, which is to say he walked into the library while she was dusting the upper shelves and said, without preamble, "What is your name?" She nearly dropped the cloth. "Sarah Finch, sir," she said. "I'm one of the housemaids." He was taller than she had registered from a distance, dark-haired, perhaps 35, with the particular kind of stillness about him that comes either from very good self-control or from a great deal of practice at looking unreadable. He was looking at the bookshelves, not at her. "Has anything been moved in here since the estate changed hands?" "Not that I know of, sir." He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected, and then he looked at her. It was a brief look, the kind that catalogues and files and moves on, but it was more direct than most looks she'd received in the weeks she'd been there, and she felt the back of her neck go cold. "Carry on," he said, and left. She carried on. She was careful about it. The house had a rhythm she knew better than anyone, including the staff who had worked there for years, because she had grown up in it. She knew which floorboards on the east corridor gave way under the third step, and which door in the servants' hall never quite latched, and where the draft came from in the upstairs sitting room on nights when the wind came from the north. This knowledge was both useful and dangerous. Twice she caught herself moving around a familiar obstacle before she could have known it was there, and both times she stopped and pretended to adjust something and hoped no one had noticed. Mrs. Holt, she suspected, noticed everything. The trouble, the real trouble, began with the portrait. It had hung in the upper gallery since before Seraphina was born. It was a painting of her grandmother as a young woman, done in the Flemish style with a dark background and careful attention to the lace at the collar. And it was the sort of portrait that followed you with its eyes, because the painter had been skilled enough to make the eyes almost alive. Seraphina had always found it slightly unsettling. She had also, growing up, been told repeatedly that she looked very like her grandmother, which meant that the portrait looked slightly like her, which she thought about now more than she had previously. She had not expected Callum Drever to notice. She had not expected him to say, one afternoon, when he came upon her in the gallery with a basket of cut flowers she was meant to be arranging for the side tables, "There's a resemblance." She did not look at the portrait. She said, "Sir, between you and the woman in that painting." He was looking at the portrait, not at her. "It's probably coincidence. You must get that often." "I don't think so, sir," she said, which was technically true in that no one in the household had said it, and she turned back to the flowers and he said nothing more. But she noticed, after that he looked at the portrait more than he used to. She noticed this because she had developed the habit of noticing where he was in the house and calibrating her own location accordingly. Not avoiding him exactly, but managing. She was good at managing. She had been managing since February, and she had not collapsed yet. What she was less good at was the evenings. The evenings were the worst of it, because the evenings were when she had nothing to do with her hands and nowhere to be, except the small room she shared with Agnes, one of the kitchen girls who was 16 and cheerful, and went to sleep immediately, and slept like the uncomplicated dead. Seraphina lay awake listening to the sounds of her own house settle into the night. The familiar creak of the east beam, the particular complaint of the back stairs, the way the old oak outside the north window moved in the wind in a pattern she had known all her life. And she thought about her father. She thought about him often. This was not straightforward. Her father had not been a bad man. This was important to her in a way that was also not straightforward. He had not been bad, only careless, and not even careless in the way that could be condemned, only in the ordinary way of a man who trusted the future to handle what the present had made difficult, and was then, as futures tend to be, wrong about this. He had loved her. She believed that. The loving and the leaving of her with nothing were not contradictions she had resolved, but they were contradictions she had learned to hold at the same time. What she had not known, until the solicitor came with his hat in his hands, was about the letter. It was waiting for her, the solicitor had said, at Asheville. Her father had written it before he died. He had left it in a particular place, a place she would know, and he had not told the solicitor where, because he had wanted only Seraphina to find it. The solicitor had seemed faintly aggrieved about this. Seraphina had been too stunned to ask the right questions, and by the time she thought of them, the estate had been sold and the solicitor had moved on to other clients, and what she was left with was a letter somewhere in her own house that she could not get to. She had thought of it every day since. She thought of it now, in April, lying awake in the small room off the servants' hall, listening to Agnes breathe. The letter was in the house. She was in the house. The problem was finding a reason to be in the right part of the house at the right time without being seen. She knew exactly where it was. Her father had had a way of hiding things. It was one of the small, specific pieces of knowledge she carried about him, that, when something mattered to him, he put it in the false back of the cabinet in the morning room, the one her grandfather had built as a joke, and which her grandmother had used for her private correspondence, and which her father had used for documents he did not want his solicitor to find until after he was dead. She went on a Wednesday morning, during the hour when Mrs. Holt took her accounts in the kitchen and Callum Drever was out riding. The morning room was cold. No one had lit the fire. The cabinet was where it had always been between the window and the chimney breast, and the false back was where it had always been. And behind the false back was a packet of papers tied with the same brown string her father had always used for everything, because he was not a man who changed his habits, and she stood in the cold morning room with the packet in her hands and could not open it. She stood there for a long time. Miss Finch. She turned around. Callum Drever was in the doorway. He was still in his riding coat, which meant he had come back early, which meant he had been in the house when she had told herself he wasn't, which meant she had miscalculated. She looked at him. He looked at the packet in her hands. Neither of them moved. "Those belong to the estate," he said. His voice was even. She could not tell if it was the even of a man who was angry, or the even of a man who was not yet sure what he was. "They belong to me," she said. She heard herself say it and understood that it was over. The name, the borrowed dress, the pins in her hair. It was all finished now, and she was too tired to be frightened of that. She set the packet on the table between them and untied the string, and she did not look away from him while she did it. And when it was opened, she turned the first page toward him so he could see her father's handwriting and the date, and at the top, her name. Her real name. "For my daughter, Seraphina, Countess of Asheville." He read it. He read all of it, she thought, or enough of it. She watched his eyes move across the page and then go still and then move again. He read in the particular way of a man who was used to contracts, which is to say carefully and without expression, and she stood across the table from him and waited. When he looked up, he said, "How long have you been in this house?" "6 weeks," she said. As Sarah Finch, "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She held herself very still. "Your father wrote this the week before he died," he said. "It was not a question. The letter was dated." "I believe so. He left instructions that only you could retrieve it. He knew where I would look." Callum Drever set the letter down and walked to the window and looked out at the front drive and the iron gates at the end of it and the road beyond. She watched his back. She tried to read his posture and found it unreadable. "He named you his heir," he said, "in a letter written after the estate was sold." "He named me his daughter," she said. "The rest is a separate question." He turned around then. He looked at her differently than he had ever looked at her before, which made sense, because she was a different person than he had thought she was. And she wondered what it felt like from his side to have the ground shift like that under a thing you'd bought and thought you understood. "Why not simply come to me?" he said. "When you arrived, why the deception?" She thought about how to answer that. "You had purchased the house," she said. "You had every legal right to do so. I had no rights of any kind. If I had come to you as Lord Wycliffe's daughter and asked for the morning room cabinet, I would have been a stranger with a claim and no basis for it. As Sarah Finch, I could at least—" She paused. "I could at least be here." He said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked. "There is also the matter," he said after a moment, "of the portrait. My grandmother, you're very like her. People have said so." "I noticed the first afternoon," he said. "I thought it was coincidence." "It wasn't." "No," he said. "I see that now." He was quiet for another moment, and then he crossed back to the table and picked up the letter again and read the second page, which she had not told him existed. Her father had written 3 pages in total. The first was the formal declaration, her name, her parentage, the acknowledgement that she was legitimate, which had been in question because of the circumstances of her mother's first marriage, and which her father had never fully resolved while he was alive. The second page was not formal at all. The second page was her father's handwriting going slightly unsteady, the way it had in his last years, and it was not a legal document. It was an apology. She looked at the window while he read it. He set it down again carefully, the way you set down something that is not yours to handle roughly. "He was afraid you wouldn't forgive him," Callum Draver said. "I know. Have you?" She thought of the east beam at night, the oak tree moving, the particular creaking vocabulary of this house that she had learned before she could read and would carry until she died. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded once. Then he said, "I'll need to speak with my solicitor." She had not expected that. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she did not have a word for yet, but thought she might find one later. "The letter may not constitute a legal claim," he said, "but you are Lord Wycliffe's legitimate daughter, and that constitutes something. I am not in the habit of purchasing things and then discovering that the terms were different than I was told." "The terms were not misrepresented," she said carefully. "My father's debts were real. The sale was legal." "That's not what I mean," he said. She waited. "I mean," he said, "that you should not be cleaning my windows." It was so plain and so unexpected that she almost laughed. She didn't. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the table. "You should sit down," he said. "I'll have someone bring tea. Then I'll find Mrs. Holt and explain that Sarah Finch was not, as it turns out, who she said she was. She'll be annoyed. She's always annoyed. I don't think my news will change the baseline." This time she did smile, just slightly, and he saw it, and something in his face that had been careful became less so. It took 3 weeks to sort out the legal question because legal questions were like that. There was a solicitor in London and another in the county, and a great deal of correspondence that arrived in envelopes that Seraphina was no longer responsible for collecting from the front hall. Callum Draver gave her the use of the blue bedroom, which was the nicest of the guest rooms, and she spent the 3 weeks in a peculiar suspension. No longer Sarah Finch, not quite anything else, occupying the house in a status no one had a word for. She walked in the mornings. She was relearning the grounds, or allowing herself to remember them, which was different. The kitchen garden still planted the way her mother's gardener had planted it, because the new groundskeeper had not seen any reason to change a thing that worked. The oak near the north wall, immense and settled and completely indifferent to the matter of inheritance. Callum Drever joined her on the third morning. He did not explain his presence. He simply appeared at the garden gate when she was passing it, and fell into step beside her, and they walked the length of the east field in silence, which she found less uncomfortable than she would have predicted. "You know this place," he said eventually. Not an accusation. "Yes, I can tell. You move through it like," he paused, selecting a word. "Like water. Like you know exactly how much space you take up and how it fits." She thought about that. "I think that's what it's like to grow up somewhere," she said. "You carry the map of it before you know that's what you're doing." He nodded. He was looking at the line of elms at the far edge of the field, and she had the sense that he was thinking about something else, in the way that people do when they're thinking about something directly, but want to approach it from a different angle. "My solicitor thinks the letter gives you a basis for a claim against the estate," he said. "Not the property, the title. Your father was acknowledged Earl. You would be Countess, under the right conditions." "The right conditions being?" "A great many letters and some patience and a willingness to be uncomfortable for a while." She almost laughed again. She was noticing that she almost laughed more in his presence than she had in the months since February, which she was not sure what to do with. "I have experience being uncomfortable," she said. "I know," he said. "I watched you clean my library for 6 weeks." They reached the far corner of the field and turned back toward the house. The morning light was coming down through the elms, and the grass was still wet, and the manor at the end of the drive looked exactly as it had always looked. And she was grateful for that, even though she was not the person she had been when she had last seen it from this angle. "There's another matter," he said. "Yes?" He stopped walking. She stopped too, and looked at him, and found that he was looking back at her with an expression she had learned to recognize over 3 weeks of unexpected proximity as the one he wore, when he was about to say something he had thought about considerably, and was still not entirely sure was wise. "I bought this house," he said, "because I had reached an age at which it seemed reasonable to have somewhere to be. I had spent a great many years moving things from one place to another, and I was tired of the movement, and I wanted a house. A particular house. I looked at 12 estates and chose this one." "Why this one?" she asked. She found she genuinely wanted to know. "The oak," he said, "the one by the north wall. I walked around the grounds and I saw that tree, and I thought, that tree has been here for 300 years and will be here for 300 more, and I would like to live somewhere where something that old exists in the garden." She looked at him. "The letter changes things," he said. "Not the legal question, that can be managed, but the situation. You are not who I thought you were, and I am not, I think, in the position I thought I was in." "Which position is that?" He looked at her steadily. "A man alone in a house he bought," he said, wondering if the woman who grew up in it might consider staying. Not as Sarah Finch, not as a guest. As he paused again, and he was not the kind of man who paused often, and she understood that the pause meant something. As the person who knows where every floorboard gives way and where every draft comes from, and who is, as it turns out, considerably more than I had been told to expect. She thought about the evening in February when the solicitor had come with his hat in his hand. She thought about Mrs. Treadwell's kitchen and the 4 days it had taken. She thought about her father's second page, the handwriting gone slightly unsteady, the apology she had not yet entirely accepted and was working on. She looked at the house at the end of the drive. The morning light had shifted and was catching the upper windows now, making them look as they always had in April, as they had when she was a child pressing her face against the glass to see the deer. "I'd want the morning room," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The morning room? It was my mother's. My father used it after she died. I've always liked the way the light comes in. The morning room," he said, "is entirely available." She looked at him. He was watching her with that careful expression she was beginning to think. Not careful at all, but simply the face of a man who did not know how to show things quickly and needed time. "Then I suppose," she said, "I'll stay." The oak by the north wall had indeed been there for 300 years. It did not notice what happened in the field that morning. It had seen any number of arrivals and departures and declarations made in its general direction, and it held no opinion on the matter. But it had been there to see her come home.